Well, this is called Cave 4. This, as you can see, is not a natural cave. There may have been something here originally. It's an artificially hollowed out cave for the purpose of storage of manuscripts. If you look, you'll actually see holes where they probably had shelves, shelf bar holes, just like a modern library. And this was the motherlode of all the Dead Sea Scrolls, what we call the Qumran manuscripts. In here were, no one's done a final reckoning, there must have been maybe 375,000 fragments of manuscripts in here, just piled up almost to the top, mixed with bat guano, mud, dung, everything you can think of that had piled up over the years. So when they finally, the problem was that they didn't find it themselves. When I say they, the archaeologist teams, led by a Dominican father called Father DeVoe, who had been a Vatican diplomat right before the scrolls were found, and when the partition occurred in Jerusalem, he was Johnny on the spot to take advantage of the situation, not only as a diplomat, but as a very able political negotiator. So the Jordanian authorities were not interested in having anything to do with the scrolls. So basically, as the Vatican representative in the new Jordan, Palestine, the partition having already occurred, he presented himself as a person who could deal with the situation. So they let it over to him to control the scrolls coming in from Jordan at that time. From 1948 onwards, the partition had occurred, so where the scrolls were being found was in Jordan, or occupied Jordan, the West Bank. We're sitting in the West Bank area here, recaptured by Israel in 1967. Between 48 and 67, therefore, Father DeVoe and his colleagues, the ones he chose and vetted, had complete control. In 1952, when Father DeVoe heard, after Cave 1 had been found, which had been found in the middle of the Arab-Israeli fighting, that there were more scrolls coming in, the Bedouins had found more scrolls, and not the archaeologists or the Dominican fathers who he represented, he sent a survey team out in the field. This was run by Dominican fathers, and the people they used were Bedouins. So Cave 2 is what triggered it in 52. They didn't find that, but they found Cave 3. Cave 3 is up about a kilometer in the actual limestone cliffs. These are limestone marls, limestone mixed with mud, and that's why we call them marls. And so Cave 3 had the copper scroll lying on the floor, just open, 2 rolls of copper. Turned out to be an incredible find, the temple treasure list, but not much else in Cave 3. The next cave found was this one, therefore we call it Cave 4. This was also found in 1952, and the point of this one is that DeVoe's surveyors had missed this cave, even though from where he was digging on the plateau of Qumran, where the ruins are, it's visible by eye. He was questioned about that, and he said, well, he didn't think it was important, something on the marls, or else other times he's quoted, I think, as saying, I can't be sure, he didn't see anything here. Regardless of what he said, he didn't find it, and the Bedouin found that right after he did his survey, which is very suspicious if not upsetting, and when the survey stopped and DeVoe went home, they cleaned this cave out completely and sent all the fragments up to Jerusalem. And one of the painful aspects of their having done that was the Bedouin worked in work gangs. And they had to pay each other off for the money they received. Now the official team, what we call the international team, run by DeVoe and his colleagues, and we also call them the consensus because they developed a theory of Qumran origins called the Essene theory. The consensus group thought that the way to stop a black market in scrolls was to set an official price for whatever they brought in. So they hit on a certain number of piastres, say 30 piastres per square centimeter. I don't know the exact price. It seemed rational to them at the time, but the problem was it worked to the detriment of large manuscripts. When the Bedouins worked as a team and they found a large piece, and let's say 5 or 10 Bedouin had been working on this, they would just rip it up in little pieces, give all the work members a piece of the manuscript. They'd take it up to the Jerusalem authorities and get their per square centimeter payment. This, we think, we don't have the proof of it, added to the destruction of the materials here in this cave. That gets us to your original question. What was found here in this cave? What was found here in this cave, aside from the terribly bad condition and the numerous fragments, were, we estimate, around 2,600 different manuscripts. Of those, some were found in multiple copies. So we actually have 800 or so different documents. In this cave, therefore, this was the motherlode of all Qumran documents. Unfortunately, the condition was extremely poor of a lot of them. But through scholarly research and careful examination, you could basically tell what kind of manuscript you were dealing with through handwriting styles. You could match up the fragments with the same handwriting, threw them on a big pile, and I wanted to resort them out. I would be able to see which pieces went with which just by the handwriting. You could locate a given document or a given work of a given scribe just by the handwriting style. So that's how they did it, and that's why they became so interested in paleography and handwriting styles, because the way they grouped documents, pieces together was through handwriting. Okay, so suppose you had about 40 some odd biblical books in multiple copies that were here, and every book of the Bible was found here except Esther. There's a reason why Esther probably wasn't found here. Then that means you had approximately about 600 some odd extra biblical manuscripts. Manuscripts that you'd never seen before, and that was where the exciting literature was. So we're talking about a huge catch or hoard of some 600 different manuscripts. The biblical manuscripts are interesting, but they basically verify that the Bible text we have now, coming down through the Septuagint, the Greek text, and the Hebrew text, the Masoretic text, more or less have the Bible the way they had it here with slight differences. But the interesting things are the never-before texts. We call those sectarian texts, or basically non-biblical texts. So we have 600 some odd of those, and that's where the exciting drama of interpreting what the scrolls mean came into play. So this is K4, the granddaddy of them all. And what we're looking for next door is the granddaddy's cousin. Because our theory is this, that if they could hollow out this cave, suppose they had too many manuscripts for this cave. Why didn't they hollow out another cave right next door? Now, our radar ground scans have shown that there are what seem to be hollow areas in the several Mars adjourning this. In 1992, we did ground scans of this whole cliffs, up and down the whole cliffs, and we only found empty areas in one area, right in the Mars next to this one. So we're not pie-eyed optimists, but we hope and we believe that if there are additional storehouses of manuscripts, artificially hollowed out caves, that's where they're going to be, and that's why we're pounding into that wall.
Were the books of the Bible exact copies of the Old Testament?
Most of the books of the Bible that were found here, it isn't were they exact copies, it's whether the Old Testament as we know it are exact copies of these. Most of the books of the Bible agree with what we have in our Bibles. You know, even the Jewish and the Christian and the Protestant Bibles don't agree. Because if you look at your Catholic Bible, you'll see it has a different number of books than the Protestant Bible. It has what we call the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. The reason is that the Catholic Bible came down through Greek-Latin sources, the Septuagint that had been translated from the Hebrew in Alexandria in the 2nd century BC, and then on through scholars like Jerome into a Latin version in the 4th century AD, and that ultimately became the Vulgate. If you look, that differs from the Protestant Bible, because when the Protestant Bible split away from the Catholic Bible, they said, look, why should we use the Catholic Bible? Let's go back to the horse's mouth itself. Let's go back to the Jews. Presumably they know what the Bible was. So the Jews put the Bible as they knew it together, unfortunately, in 100 AD. That is after the wars against Rome from 66 to 70. By that time, Judaism was in control of what we now refer to as rabbis, the inheritors of Pharisaic Judaism. And they were very dubious about certain books of the Bible. So their collection did not reflect what may have been operating previously as so-called Bible. There was no Bible previously. As you'll see in these caves, there were only scrolls. Each scroll represents a certain book of the Bible. It takes a committee to put it together. So the Protestant went back to the Jewish Masoretic text, a text that was basically developed around 100 AD after the revolts. So they missed a lot of the books that the Catholic Bible had. I'll show you a conundrum of that if you don't mind. The Maccabee books. We're now in the time of the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. But the Jews don't have any books telling them how to celebrate Hanukkah because the rabbis in 100 AD determined in their wisdom that the Hanukkah books were troublemaking books. that the Hanukkah books encouraged the Jews to revolt against Rome and be more obstreperous than was wise for their own good. But the Catholic books have the Hanukkah books, have Maccabees 1 and 2. But the Catholics don't celebrate Hanukkah. So how do you like that for a conundrum? The Catholics have the Maccabean books but don't observe them. The Jews don't have the Maccabean books but do observe them. The Protestants follow the Jewish Bible because they thought that the Jewish Bible would be more authentic. And that's where we stand with Bible books. So even the Bible books don't agree with each other as we have them. So we have basically variations from Bible to Bible, which makes the idea of the Word of God is perfect a little bit dubious, since the different texts don't agree anyway, the different collections don't agree. But certainly the ones we have here are the earliest that we know of circulating texts of what we would refer to as biblical books. But one should be clear, there was no final Bible yet at the time the scrolls were put in the caves. The law and the prophets did enjoy special reverence. That is, the law of Moses, the first 5 books, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy were held in awe. You can see that they spoke of the Torah here of Moses in the collections here. The prophets also had already enjoyed special reverence. But the writings, what the Jews call the writings, the Jews separate their Bible into 3 parts. Law, prophets, writings. The writings would include things like Ruth, Ecclesiastes, Wisdom, a lot of books of that kind. Job had not reached a level of holiness so that the rabbi said to touch them didn't dirty the impurity of your hands. They were just non-holy writings. And a book like, for instance, Daniel, but for the rabbis, this was a very a questionable book, because Daniel is full of apocalyptic revolutionary ideas. So if you look in a Protestant Christian Bible, Catholic Bible, you'll find Daniel put under writings, put under prophets. If you look in a Jewish Bible, you'll find Daniel put only under writings, because the rabbis downplayed Daniel for the same reason they downplayed the Maccabee books, because these were books liable to encourage Jews to embark on foolhardy revolutions, as far as they saw it, against great powers like Rome. Now, last point about that, here in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Daniel is held in very high regard, and he would have been put among the prophets. Quotation from Daniel are widespread in the scroll materials, so there the scrolls show themselves more like early Christianity. I don't know if that's interesting to you. That may be too long-winded.
No,
I'll say one word about Esther.
Sure, please.
And you can always cut if you want. Esther is a special case, and I think a very interesting case. Esther is the basis of the Hebrew festival of Purim. But if you look at Esther, what would be for this group that is responsible for the writings here is a very hard-nosed, very apocalyptic, extremely unforgiving, fairly intolerant, militant group. I don't think they represent the normal picture of Essenes that people have. But one thing I think they would not tolerate. Esther shows a Jewish woman marrying a foreigner in order to save her people. Well, the scrolls actually would not even consider that a Jewish woman should marry a foreigner or to be part of his harem just so his people could be saved, because as far as they're concerned, they're very strict on these things. She would have been involved in fornication from the get-go. Basically, she sold herself to this foreign ruler, and the scroll people would not have thought there was anything admirable about that having been done, whereas Pharisaic Judaism, which was more accommodating to foreign rule, would have seen this as basically a very virtuous act. And so the Pharisees, Rabbinic Judaism, the Pharisees, Rabbinic Judaism to be, includes a book like Esther in their writings. I think the reason Esther is missing from here is this group by no means would have countenanced a book like Esther as being something admirable or recommendable. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, no, it does.
In their eyes, she would just be basically a fornicator.
Were these Essenes or Zealots?
Well, that's what the argument has been in Dead Sea Scrolls from the beginning. The DeVoe people, since they got control of the manuscripts, laid down in conjunction with some other professors, most of them at Harvard, Frank Moore Cross and others who were here in Palestine when the scrolls came in, developed a network, being all part of the editing team. And nobody was allowed to be in the editing team who didn't adhere to their original assumption that these were Essenes. Now, people like me do not have anything against these being Essenes, as long as we define Essenes by what these documents themselves say, not by what people think Essenes are. In other words, if you have an idea, which these gentlemen mostly had, many of them were members of orders or clerical background of one kind or another, certainly ministers, even Professor Cross, I think, originally had a theological training. Certainly DeVoe and his French Catholic assistant from Poland, Father Milik, who did most of his translating for him. He was a good translator of manuscript. These were people who were actually belonged to the Dominican order, which is a very severe order, and I hate to say, but in the Middle Ages were the people who ran the Inquisition, but that's neither here nor there. You can cut that out if you don't like that. But the point is they vetted everything when it came in, and they didn't, since the Jordanian government had given them absolute power from 1952 onwards, they didn't allow anyone on the so-called International Committee who didn't agree with their views. So the Essene theory became the official theory. The problem is these scrolls did have Essene characteristics: purity-mindedness, bathing habits, references to the Holy Spirit, things like this, but that also had an extremely aggressive militancy. And what was clear from the beginning of looking at the documents, which makes the Copper Scroll so interesting, they had a political agenda too. They were not apolitical. They were not uninterested in politics. But one thing they could not abide, and all the documents are consistent on this, they could not abide foreign armies in the country. So this was really a national revolutionary movement as well as being an Essene movement. And you have to go by the documents. And the interesting thing about the documents, some have said, oh, this is just a collection of documents. Norman Gold from the University of Chicago is well known. That's his single theory, that this is a collection of Jerusalem writings. No, this is not a collection of simply Jerusalem writings. Some of them may have been penned there. These writings are consistent across the board. You never get a compromising document here. You never get an accommodating document here. You never get one approving of Roman rule or foreign rule in Palestine. You never get one approving of foreign appointed high priests. You never get one approving of fornication, of niece marriage, of polygamy, of the king marrying a non-Jewish woman. I mean, these are like consistent down the line. So, let's go to the bottom line. What have we said? They are a combination of Essenes and Zealots. Well, we get these terminologies from a Jewish historian of the first century called Josephus. And in Josephus's work, he outlines the different groups. Well, it turns out Josephus wrote several works where he changes his discussion. Josephus turns out to be a very slippery person. Some works he wrote in the 70s when he felt less secure, having been a turncoat and cooperating with the Roman imperial family, from which he got his name Flavius. He was the original Ben-Hur. He was adopted into the Roman imperial family and given their name Flavians, because they were the new imperial family that succeeded the Julio Claudians. So he was Flavius. But in the 90s, when he wrote his second work, his autobiography and his Antiquities, he felt much more secure in his position, obviously, and lots of data that he didn't include in the Jewish War in the 70s, he refined and refurbished in the 90s. So suddenly he's willing to tell us much more about the Zealot movement in the 90s than he is in the 70s. In the 70s, he promises to talk about the Zealot movement, but doesn't do it. In the 90s, he cuts a whole segment from his description of the Essenes in the 70s and puts it under his description of the Zealots in the 90s. So we see there's some fluidity of taking what the actual groups were. Finally, there's another version of Josephus that oddly was concerned by a curious manuscript attributed to a church father, Hippolytus, in Rome in the 3rd century. And this is clearly from Josephus. And there, Hippolytus says, and I think this is the truth of the situation, clearly quoting Josephus, there were 4 groups of Essenes. There were normative Essenes, there were Essene Zealots, there were Essene, or Zealot Essenes, there were Sicarii Essenes, and there was a 4th group. I forget what the 4th group was. But that means he recognized groups that combine characteristics of both. Now the Sicarii Essenes really are interesting, because the Sicarii Essenes, which I think Qumran really represents, are the kind of people that Josephus hates in his work, that he calls, Sicarii means Roman short sword. It can also mean the circumciser's knife. It was the curved kind of knife that you even see Bedouins today carry across their breasts when you go down to the Arabian Peninsula. It was originally the Roman short sword, but it had a curve to it. It was also for Josephus the sword of the assassin, or the knife of the assassins, who mingled in the 50s among the crowds in Jerusalem and assassinated their political adversaries. A little bit like Hamas or something now, and or Hezbollah or something like that. It also turns out that these Sicarii, the name is from Josephus, it is a pejorative because it means knife people. I'm sure they didn't call themselves knife people. They had a different name for themselves, maybe Zealot Essenes. They certainly didn't call themselves knife people. That's Josephus's pejorative word. They're the ones who, it turns out, fled Jerusalem in the middle of the uprising and took Masada. And they're the ones who held out on Masada until long after Jerusalem fell, and we'll go down to Masada and look at it, until 73, where they committed mass suicide in the somewhat the Japanese samurai style. Killed all their families rather than allow the Romans take them prisoner, killed themselves, some thousand, some odd men, women, and children. You say, what was the reason for that? The reason for that is, rather than give their women and children to slavery to be used the way the Romans used people, maybe sexually, maybe brutalized, maybe polluted, and so on, they wanted to enjoy the kingdom with their children, and the only way to enjoy the kingdom was that they should be pure. So they buried under the synagogue floor, and we can show that at Masada, the bones passage from Ezekiel. The bones passage from Ezekiel is the passage about the resurrection and the rising of the bones. I intuited from that the Sicarii believed in resurrection of the dead, and that they believed that if they would go impure into death, they would meet each other again. In any case, this Sicarii group, ultimately, other leftovers go down into Egypt, and Josephus tells us they are troublemakers in Egypt in the 80s and 90s. They're troublemakers in North Africa. So they continue this uprising. So I would think that what we have here at Qumran, and Qumran documents were found on Masada, is a version of this Sicarii Essene group. But I would prefer to call them the Messianic movement in Palestine. I think that was a much clearer name for them rather than all these pejorative names. Why the Messianic movement in Palestine, which again gets us to Christian origins? Because over and over and over again they refer to the star prophecy. The star prophecy comes from Numbers 24:17, the prophecy that a star will rise from Jacob, a scepter to rule the world. This is in at least 3 known documents from Qumran and plays a central place. This is, for the Gospels, the star over Bethlehem paradigm. And the world ruler, the Messiah, was supposed to be called the star as far as they understood it. And the second Jewish uprising that continued after the first, and there was a second one in 132 to 136, the leader was known as Bar Kokhba, but he adopted the term Bar Kokhba, Kokhba meaning star, son of the star, because he understood that the star prophecy was the moving force of revolutionary activity in Palestine. Josephus lets the cat out of the bag at the end of the Jewish war. He says, the thing that most moved our young men to revolt against Rome was the prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. And that's the star prophecy. So in my mind, what we have at Qumran is not only the literature of the Essene or Essene Zealot movement, but also of the Messianic movement and, in fact, the revolutionary movement against Rome. I'm sorry to give you so much in one bite.
Stop. I'm running out of tape.
Yeah, and you can ask me, if this is all important.
Shoot.
Well, the Hippolytus manuscript, which most people overlook, I only discovered it in more recent times, a tremendous eye-opener, because he describes the Sicarii Essenes, and it's very odd to group Sicarii with Essenes. And he says that what they would do if they heard anyone talking about the law who was not circumcised, they would either, like a Muslim in modern day, either offer him Islam or the sword. They would actually kill him or allow him to be circumcised. He could choose circumcision or be killed. In other words, that's how holy they took the law to be. So this illustrates a little bit of their mentality. Then he says that in our recent war with Rome, and Josephus says the same thing about Essenes in the Jewish war, but he puts it slightly different. He said their bravery was incredible to us who were observing it. Josephus knew these things because he was an interrogator of a prisoner. He had betrayed his cause. He had gone over to the Romans. He had applied the star prophecy, the world ruler prophecy, both to Vespasian and Titus. In return, he had become their pampered part of their entourage, given a Roman name. But he ended up, which is why his data is so encyclopedic and why we're so grateful for it, being an interrogator of prisoners. So he knew whereof he spoke. In fact, there's one incredible episode in the war where Josephus is representing the Roman side and the city is under siege and all the revolutionaries are on the ramparts, and Josephus has been sent out by Titus, the son of the Roman emperor to be, General Vespasian, to try to ask them to surrender. And he goes around the walls and he calls up asking them in their own language to surrender. And they're all watching him from the ramparts, and suddenly someone throws a sling and a stone hits him on the head, and he falls, and this is a true story, I think, falls down in a swoon, and he admits in his manuscript that a huge cheer went up from the ramparts because everyone thought that their enemy Josephus was dead. This is a beautiful human moment. Of course, he did just get up, limp away, he has a wounded head. It would make a good Hollywood story. In any case, he says that these Essenes exhibited tremendous bravery under torture and participated in the recent war against Rome. Well, that goes against what most people think Essenes do, not fight, retiring, are apolitical. They were one of the groups that were participating in the war against Rome. One of the leaders was John the Essene. We have a war scroll in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We call that Qumran. That dovetails very, very nicely with that. But he says that under torture, they would not call any man Lord, whether the Roman emperor or Jesus. They would not call any man Lord. You could not force them to call any man Lord. They would not curse or blaspheme the lawgiver, Moses or the law or so on. And finally, he said, and this is in Hippolytus' version, they would not eat things sacrificed to idols. Nothing could make them eat things sacrificed to idols. Now, in the normal Jewish war, the earlier version, in Greek, Josephus says they would not eat forbidden things. Hippolytus says they would not eat things sacrificed to idols. Go to your New Testament. Go to the exchanges between James and Paul. What do you find in the book of Acts 15 and 21? James bans things sacrificed to idols for overseas Christian believers. Repeats the ban in 21. Paul in 1 Corinthians 8 to 12 attacks James's ban on things sacrificed to idols. He laughs at it. He heaps scorn on it. He says, why should we worry about eating things sacrificed to idols? He says, idol is nothing in this world. It's just in their mind. But he says, since these people are weak, since they have weak consciences, meaning James and all of the others, the leadership, the people who observe the law, because they are so weak, when they are present, don't eat things sacrificed to idols while they are here. And because of them, I will not eat meat again forever. In other words, I am a vegetarian like they were. But in the very next chapter, he says, eat anything in the butcher shops. There are no forbidden things. And finally, in chapters 11 and 12, he goes on to evoke his doctrine of communion with the body and blood of Christ. He goes on, in fact, to talk about eating Jesus' body in symbolic form as a wafer or bread and drinking his blood, which would have been total anathema to Jewish people. And if you look at Acts and James's instructions, along with things sacrificed to idols, is the ban on blood. So we have a real confrontation there developing between Paul and James on just the issue, Josephus says, was the thing that Essenes refused to bend on and preferred death under any torture. They preferred death under any torture for those things. Not eating things sacrificed to idols, not blaspheming the lawgiver, and the third was not calling any man Lord. So they preferred death, and Josephus admired the tolerance of pain that they showed in these torture sessions, which he was certainly present at and having a good deal of fun torturing them. Sorry to add that, but you might. Okay, so now we're coming into Cave 4, which was really the which really where the lion's share of the manuscripts from Qumran were found. This is a completely artificially hollowed out cave, hollowed out by hand. There may have been some original, pothole or something in here, but this was done by chisels, and it had all the aspects of a library in the sense that you can see that here we have wall holes. These are really wall holes where shelves would have been. So this was a repository of books and manuscripts, and it moved over and was done by hand out of this very soft limestone mixed with mud, which we call a marl. And coming in here, you get a mystical feeling. This is like, if you've not been in here and you've come to Qumran or the Dead Sea, until you come here, you don't feel the mystery and the mysticism of what this place was all about. This is like an incredible place just to stand in. What was found here were the mother lode of all Qumran documents. The problem is the documents were just thrown in here helter-skelter. Probably they came up this high. I mean, I wasn't here when it was found, but probably people actually walked on them. So that means there were documents just thrown in here helter-skelter. Bat dung, bat guano would be in here, mudslide, rain, everything. It was just one matted slop. And that doesn't mean the Western archaeologists found it, because the Western archaeologists didn't find it. The people who found it were the Bedouin. And that's a story in itself. Why the Western archaeologists missed this? Because missing this, they missed a chance to catalog all of what was in here in a correct manner. As it was, you say, how did they get most of this material? Well, we don't know. They did get most of this material. What they got was brought up to the Jerusalem market and sold on the Jerusalem market, and went into under the auspices of a team called the International Team that was located at the Rockefeller Museum at that time, headed by a French Dominican father, the head of the Dominican order in Palestine, called Father Roland DeVoe. And he organized the team, and everything that came in under his supervision, and they bought it from the antiquities market. So they assumed it came from here, but there may be a lot of things that came from here that we never saw. In addition, the crews that worked here had another defect going for them. The official team, since they hadn't found this cave themselves, had decided the best way to get the materials from here was to set a price so there wouldn't be a black market. So they set a square centimeter price for the fragments that came from here. And let's say, I don't know what it was, but let's say 15 piastre a centimeter or something, thinking that that would be the official price and people would come up. Well, the problem is that the Bedouin who cleaned this place out worked in teams. And if they didn't realize there was a premium on large, complete manuscripts. So they got a large, complete manuscript perhaps here, and they would just rip it up in little bits, give each of the person who had worked on it his little bit. And that increased, we think, the deterioration of what came out of here. So what came out of here was like some 350,000 different fragments of material. Scholars have been working to piece much of it together. Often it's a thankless task, but really, I mean, we get the general gist of the material here. I mean, all the documents are consistent in terms of their outlook. They're in harmony in terms of the nature of what they're looking at. They're a militant group. They're an uncompromising group. You never find a document coming out of here compromising, let us say, for instance, with foreign power. Or a document, let us say, that shows any love for a group we now seem to think are the Pharisees, those who became official Judaism after the Roman takeover in 70 AD when the temple fell, those who were willing to live with the Romans and ultimately were sponsored by the Romans. This is clearly, however their ideology is laid out, whether you think of them as Essenes, Zealots, Sicarii, or what have you, this is a resistance. This is a resistance horde of materials. People like myself and the group of thinkers about the Dead Sea Scrolls that I represent consider this to be the literature that moved the resistance against Rome. This is not some small movement. This is a vast movement. As you can see, we have 20 some odd hundred different manuscripts that have been identified through handwriting and otherwise coming from this cave. And since there are many and multiple copies, we have been able to identify 800 different manuscripts. Now there's some 40 odd biblical books. All the biblical books were found here, some in multiple copies, except the book of Esther, which means, aside from some other known works of what we call apocryphal works like Enoch, Jubilees, Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, things of that came down through Christian apocryphal collections. Apocryphal means books that got in one Bible and didn't get in another Bible, or just didn't get in any Bibles. That's the general term we use. We also use the word pseudepigrapha, false writings. But that's a pejorative term employed by clerical committees. So to me, all these documents are pseudo, so it's stupid to call some pseudo and some not. But if you put those aside, that means we have some 600 documents here never seen before. 600 extra biblical documents, 600 sectarian documents, and all of a consistent mindset. Purity conscious, very aggressive, separating holy from profane, nothing in common with the book of Acts view of Peter as learning from a voice in heaven after a tablecloth comes down saying, Peter, eat, Peter, eat. Peter saying, I've never eaten any unclean things. Then Peter learning not to separate holy from profane. Peter's original stance in that episode in the book of Acts is the stance of this group. I have never eaten any unclean thing. And this group never learns the doctrine that they should not separate holy from profane. This group consistently across all its documents believes that you should separate holy from profane.
All right, and I'm just going to follow you around.
Okay, well, these are the ruins that have been excavated from Qumran up till now. Some have been built up, but as you see from the start back there, you have a ritual immersion pool, which I can mention more about as we proceed here. Another ritual immersion pool with steps. Here is a huge cylindrical cistern that must have held thousands of gallons of water. And as we go along here, we'll see cistern after cistern. The cisterns were the raison d'etre of this community. Here, for instance, are more water channels. There's another huge cistern with steps. And probably the biggest cistern of all is, I think you'll see it right over here anyway. But the point of the water, and this is what's so amazing in a dry climate like this, is that you have the waterfall up on the mountain up there, where you can see its dry outlines, and that hardly ever runs water. But several times a year, suddenly you get a huge flood from the Bethlehem plain. The water comes rolling down through the water channels, which are carved by hand through those rocks over there, dammed up there, and slowly led down through this water channel here and stored in these cisterns. So the cisterns, the complicated water channel, the aqueduct as it is specified here, are the raison d'etre of this community. Now here is a very huge water cistern or bathing pool. As you see, it has steps in it, and some of the smaller ones have the outline of what was called a Jewish mikveh. That would be an actual Jewish immersion bath. So this is certainly, there are too many cisterns here. That's the big cistern I was talking about there, right behind you. You see it's a huge, huge cistern of vast dimensions. This is very bizarre in a dry area like this. We have to admit that this is what we would normally call in Christian apocryphal literature, or the literature of the church fathers about the sects. This is a daily bathing group, a Homero-Baptist group. If you want to call them Essenes, Some might want to call them Ebionites, the poor, the name of James's community. Some might want to call them Nazareans, after what we think of Jesus Christ, or John the Baptist followers. But whatever we have here, we have a bathing community in a very odd place. It's been my question sometimes what they did in that dry year, whether they were able to fill these cisterns enough to get enough water to do these bathing activities in an annual basis. I think sometimes this was an uninhabitable place. But on the whole, these installations are big enough and impressive enough to allow us to imagine a really functioning daily bathing community, people bathing in the morning when they got up in a ritual manner and after any kind of impurity. Behind you there, I'll start here now. Behind you there is what has been argued over a lot. That, as you see, is a very sturdy bastion-like tower. And the question has been, is it just a lookout tower? Is it just the center of the community for looking around, which is, this community, as you see, is very strategically located. You look down the road here and you can see the whole way down towards the oasis of En-Gedi and further the famous stronghold of Masada, the road along going south, the Dead Sea. And to the north, the Jericho Plain. But what about this tower here? Was it just to look out? There's been a huge argument about this, mostly led by Professor Norman Golb of the University of Chicago. And Professor Golb's point was that this was a defense tower. Others argued with him. The peaceful Essene people said, what do they need? A defense tower? These are peaceful Essenes contemplating the meaning of God in a retiring anchorite way in the wilderness. I think on the whole, Professor Golb's got the better of the point. That looks tough enough to be a defensive tower. One last point I would like to point out, the California State University Long Beach Judean Desert Exploration Project started out here under my tutelage around 1987. And we started just by doing surveys, and we were the first to bring a radar ground scan to this area, which we are now continuing in here, 2004, 12 to 14 years later, because of bureaucratic and other sorts of difficulties that emerged in the meantime. But we found that this is not complete, that in that area over there is a very large network of more underground waterworks of different kinds. And we found signatures with the radar past where those rocks are and near where those people are sitting under the awning there of a lot more ruins. We also did a radar ground scan under the tower or around the tower, and we found indications of some sort of circular well, some kind of stone object with a circular signature that had not been uncovered. And as you see, 14 years later, because of the bureaucratic competition and intricacies of internecine strife that goes on over these projects, it's still not touched. Is that all right? And I'd like to, don't bother with that sign. Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, okay. Ready? Okay, what you see before you is a typical immersion pool. It's a quasi-cistern, but you see it has steps. Steps not only for cleansing, but also steps for people to go down in it and immerse themselves in a ritual purification manner. And if you look at the documents, particularly the community rule, you'll see that this was something that was required of the community members on a daily basis. That's why we called groups like this, and they weren't just here, they were all across northern Syria into northern Iraq, down into southern Iraq. There's, even today, in southern Iraq, a group functioning called Mandans. Saddam Hussein wiped them out. They were down in the marshes, and they still wore white linen clothes like priests. They called themselves Nazariah or Nazareans. The Arabs called them the Subba of the marshes. Subba means bathing, and they were ritual daily bathers following John the Baptist to the very day, the 21st century in southern Iraq. So we had these bathing groups all across the Fertile Crescent in this period. And these were daily bathers. And I think what we're calling Essenes here at Qumran are connected to this whole movement of ritual purification going on from the Dead Sea here in Palestine all the way across northern Iraq down to southern Iraq, finally in the Subba of the marshes. Things like Manichaeism also grew out of this, and out of Manichaeism, Christianity grew out of this for sure. Manichaeism grew out of this, and out of Manichaeism grew Islam.
Manichaeism being
A missing link. Well, Mani of a daily bathing group in southern Iraq in the 200s, and the only thing I got to get it right because sometimes it's in my book, James. But Mani actually grew out of this in the 200s. He's a member of what we call an El-Kazaite group. El-Kazai means hidden power. It's an Aramaic word. It comes from Palestine somewhere in the 1st century and 2nd century. These groups spread again into northern Iraq. Many of them claim to be followers of John the Baptist. The Mandaeans in southern Iraq follow John the Baptist to this day. And Mani came from one of these families, and the only thing he changed was the food regulations and the way of purification. For Mani, you didn't have to bathe all of the time. You could clean yourself with sand and things of that kind. And those sort of rituals, Mani saw himself as a seal of the prophets. He spoke about a continuum of prophets down to him. Well, this is what Muhammad does in the Quran. What happened is that Muhammad, in the 5th and 6th centuries, encountered these Manichaean groups in southern Iraq. Muhammad encountered these Manichaean groups in southern Iraq, and out of that came his idea of the seal of the prophets, with slight variations from what Mani had been telling earlier. But Manichaeism runs at that time all the way into Persia, followed the whole Silk Road into China. It was a thriving movement for 4 or 5 centuries before Islam crushed it.
all based around water and pure.
Well, started with this El-Kazite movement. The El-Kazites in the early Christian texts follow this leader called the Righteous One or the Pure One. Probably is also related to the Qatar movement in southern France, because they call themselves the perfect and the pure ones. All these movements we don't have documented that well, but they're all involved in one way or spin-offs or variations on the same theme, being purity and practicing purity in a certain way. And of course at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the mother lode of the purity conscious people. In the New Testament, to be fair, we have the mother lode of the anti-purity conscious people. Because the whole thing of the presentation, and I call it a presentation of Jesus, is to show him as dispensing with the purity laws, saying you are not known by the food that goes into your mouth, that just goes out the body into the toilet bowl. You're known by what comes out of the mouth. Very clever rhetorical expositions and flourishes, repartees of that kind. But basically those were taken as dispensing with the purity regulations. You know, Jesus is pictured as sitting in the New Testament, and I say pictured because I don't credit these historical pictures of a Jewish messianic leader. He's pictured as sitting with tax collectors who would have been considered totally unclean, people of various physical disabilities, people with running blood who can't control their periods, things that would have horrified Jews. You know, Jews have a horror of people in their periods anyway and set them aside and won't have sexual intercourse with them in those times. Jesus, all the lame, the lepers, everything that is a banned person in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Gospels, is pictures of someone Jesus received, in particular prostitutes. Prostitutes is a total bugaboo at Qumran, and they mean by prostitutes fornicators. And they would have included by fornicators, not the Maccabean family, which we were discussing at another point, but the Herodian family, because for the people at Qumran here and for John the Baptist, the Herodian family were little more than fornicators and prostitutes because of their marital habits and their odd behavior of marrying their close relatives and all marrying their nieces, and their divorce and polygamy practices.
Right.
You have a complete thought and someone comes in who, you know, is throwing their brain waves, and you're answering their brain waves, and your thought is evaporated.
Okay, good to go here.
Okay, ready? So what you see here is an actual shot of Cave 4 from across the wadi, this being the promontory where the settlement ruins were dug first by DeVoe and now by a lot of us others. Down there we'll go momentarily to the graveyard. But here is a great shot of Cave 4, and we call these marls. These are a mixture of mud and limestone. They're not pure rock, they're marls. And that cave there with the entrance you see, one from the top and one from the side, is Cave 4. The second part of it is on the other side of it. It has an equally open chamber. Originally the two seem to have been connected, but it seems the area in between has fallen through. I can't promise that that was the way it was constructed in the original embodiment, but that's the theory. Over there to the right is another cave. All these are numbered in the order in which manuscripts were found. Cave 5, some small fragments of things were found in that little sort of hump of a marl there. The reason we're digging in the marls, and you see our team standing on top of the marls there, throwing their ladders, throwing their ropes, their climbing equipment, the radar ground scan boxes over the side, is because the theory of this expedition is that since Cave 4 was an artificially hollowed out cave within the marl, it is quite possible that some of the other marls might have been artificially hollowed out and just covered up for one reason or another. Erosion, mudslides, rain, debris, or they were purposely covered up. So 12 years ago, when we did the first ground scan of this plateau, California State University, Long Beach, under my direction, brought the equipment out from the Geophysical Survey System company of New Hampshire, the same company that's helping us sponsor to some extent our activities at the present time. In this expedition, using their upgraded gear, we found signatures of empty areas in several of those marls. We also found some signatures of empty areas over here. And in the last 2 years, under previous expeditions, we were able to dig a few out, and we did find pottery, mats, signs of habitation, nothing spectacular like manuscripts. So the radar has been working, and now we're trying to zero in to find this. According to our readers 14 years ago, we saw a huge empty area on one of the 3 adjourning fingers next to Cave 4. We're trying to identify exactly which that finger is. And we're trying to see if there's another cave like that. We're not pie-eyed optimists, we're not dreamers. We know the chances of finding anything are about 1%, if that, but we think no stone should be left unturned. If there is another cave like Cave 4, it would be like the motherlode of all motherlodes for Dead Sea Scroll documents. So it certainly is worth a little extra effort of the kind we are putting in here. And it's an interesting activity. A final comment. You see the bird just flew into that cave there, Cave 4. You see the entrance has been hit from the top, this from the side. I don't know what was there when Father DeVoe did his survey in 1952. But Father DeVoe, who was excavating this area here, missed that cave. Now, it is incredible to consider that he could have missed that cave, that an intelligent, sophisticated, civilized archaeologist could miss a cave like that. You could say that it was more covered up than it is now, but all the pictures I have seen have shown a direct hole there, and I think there was a hole there in 1952 when he was out here. Whether the hole from the top was as big, whether the front had been knocked off, which I doubt, but the hole from the side is on all pictures that I have seen. Now, it could have been smaller, but it certainly was a cave. He has said that he didn't see it. Other quotations that I have heard was he didn't think it was important. He didn't think there would be any scrolls down here. He thought they were all up in the limestone cliffs up there. Whatever the reason, he didn't send anyone in. He was paying Bedouin survey teams to do his work for him. You can see pictures of the fathers sitting in their tents, having their tea, doing their prayers, things like that. They were not a hands-on group. They sat in the European aristocratic upper-class way, enjoyed the fact that they were archaeologists in the field with cook and every other sort of amenity brought down to them, and they paid Bedouin work gangs to do the work for them. I'm not sure Bedouin work gangs always told the archaeologists the truth about what they found. In the end, the upshot was, 2 months after he finished his survey, the Bedouin found, in quotes, Cave 4, cleaned it all out. Everything went up on the Jerusalem market, and then the archaeologists came running down here again to check what they had left behind them, and lo and behold, they found Cave 4. It's a very suspicious and upsetting series of events. One of my students who first pointed this anomaly of the dating of when K4 was found out to me, I hadn't realized this. He was very worried about it and wrote a paper about it. His name was Dennis Walker. That paper has since been published in Poland. But some people with darker ideas, and I'm not a darker idea person, I don't like to give these people that much credit for intelligence, with darker ideas, since the Bedouins worked in work gangs, and since they had set a fixed price for the per square centimeter purchases to, in their words, stop the black market, the Bedouins would go in these places, rip up the manuscripts, hand them out to each person who was working, and then each person would go up to Jerusalem and get his square centimeter price for his little piece of manuscript. The Bedouins had no interest in keeping a big manuscript. So it's quite possible that this policy and missing this cave contributed to the fact that the materials from Cave 4 are in a perfectly horrendous condition of preservation. That's not to say they weren't probably badly preserved in the first place. We have even indications in there of a sword, of a sword swipe. Perhaps a Roman soldier or some angry person with a sword went in there and did some flailing around before he got disgusted and left. But in any case, this missing Cave 4 was, in fact, by the archaeologists who followed the Bedouin everywhere, this was missing the biggest bonanza in Dead Sea Scrolls studies for a very odd, fairly incomprehensible reason. Ready? Mm-hmm. Okay. What you see here is actually a kiln. It says it used to be in much better condition than it is now. It's even deteriorated in the 10 or 20 years that I've seen it, but it was the top of the kiln went all the way around. Now the discussion has been, is this just a kiln for making bread? Is it a kiln for pottery, a potter's kiln, as the sign says? He says artist's oven, but a potter's kiln? Or could more serious things like weaponry be made here? In fact, there is a more serious kiln over there by the cistern that we saw as we entered this settlement. And so they had several kilns here. The issue coming down to metal, and of course they must have made plowshare metal and other sorts of metal things to do their farming with, is weaponry. Whether it was capable of manufacturing weaponry here or not. And the partisans of the peaceful Essenes say, oh, these people would never have dreamed of doing anything to make weapons, yet there is another kiln there that could be used for metal. And of course, the partisans of the more aggressive militant Essenes, the Zealot Essenes. Originally, the Zealot theory was championed by a man called Cecil Roth of Oxford University, and G.R. Driver, his colleague there. They laid it out in great detail. Even Yigal Yadin, in studying the War Scroll, the famous Israel general who purchased the other scrolls from Israel in New York after the Syriac Metropolitan offered them for sale in the Wall Street Journal in 1952, he thought that the War Scroll was displayed Roman military tactics, contrary to some of the other people we've heard. And that he could trace that these were Roman military tactics. G.R. Driver felt the same thing. And I think it's pretty clear the Kittim, the foreign armies, seemed to be Imperial Romans, that there was some feeling that this group was preparing for a final apocalyptic war against the Roman Empire. Now you say, you can cut what you need out of here. Yeah. So I'm getting on a roll here, and I want to finish it up. Mm-hmm. You say, this is preposterous. You say, this is preposterous. How can this group imagine that they could be preparing for a final apocalyptic war against the Roman Empire? You could say the same thing about bin Laden out in Afghanistan now, and I hate to compare this group to a bin Laden type group. But bin Laden is an Islamic righteous teacher of sorts. I'm sure Muslims would consider him a righteous teacher, an old man of the mountain. And here you have another group who has documents, very incriminating documents about final war and very aggressive things about, shunning the sons of the pit, meaning all backsliding Jews and Romans and so on. And they had the idea that if they were perfectly pious, and here's where the Jesus picture does not fit in with the scrolls. So we can't say this is the Jesus movement if we accept the gospel picture or the Pauline theology. They had the idea if you were perfectly righteous, that you would be like the angels and a son of God. So they had an adoptionist notion of sonship. It's in the Dead Sea Scroll hymns that you are the sons of the Father, you were brought up on his lap. But you had to be perfectly righteous. And number two, you had to be perfectly pure. In other words, you had to follow these daily bathing ritual purity routines, not only as far as bodily purity, but in terms of the pure foods that you consume. They had a special food situation that you consume. And just like we were speaking about, the war scroll bars from the camp all the people that Jesus sits with in the Gospels. The lame, the crippled, people with a running fount, that is people who have a sexual, maybe a wet dream the night before, or a sexual disorder of some kind, people who have slept with a woman the previous night. For instance, if you know the story of David and Uriah the Hittite. When David steals Uriah the Hittite's wife, Bathsheba, Uriah the Hittite comes back from the battlefield and refuses to walk into his household. Why? Because he's in a state of ritual purity, and to go into his wife would affect his ritual purity state for holy war. So he sleeps on the doorstep where David, the bounder that he's portrayed as being in that story, and Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls know David is a problem on that story. There's a reference in the Damascus document to David's behavior on that story. In any case, Uriah the Hittite sleeps outside because he does not want to affect his ritual purity status by coming near a woman. So the war scroll and some of the other documents say no women, no young man below puberty, no one in a state of uncleanness, no blind, no deaf, no lame can enter the camps. Why? Because they're practicing perfection there, the way of perfection. The way in the wilderness is the way of perfection. This is crazy stuff. I'm not anyone saying this isn't crazy stuff. It's fanatical. It is fanatical. But these people are beautiful. They're beautiful losers. They're totally committed, and they have this beautiful poetic idea of the world. You have to open your soul to appreciate how splendid their ideology and beautiful mindset was. So what's the last point in this thing? The holy angels were with them in their camps. The holy angels marched with them in their camps. This shows that we're not peaceful Essenes here. They didn't see the holy angels as pretty putti on the wall of some Renaissance ceiling that you see in Italy or something like this, little cupids around roly-poly things with wings. They saw the holy angels as militant. The holy angels were an army of God. The holy angels were their atomic bomb, their secret weapon, the thing bin Laden is, if you like, threatening us with now. Who knows what's coming in his next series of threats. But they believed that if they led a perfectly righteous life, perfect bodily purity, led by the Messiah, and that's why you have all the quotes in the Gospels and the New Testament and in the pictures of James in the apocryphal text of the Messiah Jesus, or the Messiah himself, coming on the clouds of heaven. What are the clouds of heaven? In the war scroll, the clouds of heaven are interpreted as the heavenly host in all of its armament, who shed judgment on earth like rain on all that grows, the just and unjust alike, something like an atomic rain. This is what these people believe. This is what they were preparing for. We think it is crazy, but at that time, it's splendid poetry. All right, well, what you see here is a cistern or bathing pool, which it's been repaved, and so it's not in as pristine condition as it was even 10 or 15 years back. They've been doing some shoring up work, so it doesn't look exactly the same. But here is where they saw a crack in the steps of the cistern or the bathing pool. Now, that crack in the steps of the cistern and the bathing pool, even though there was no indication of any other cracks anywhere else particularly, led DeVoe and his team, because, you know, wishful thinking is a wonderful thing, to run with this idea that there had been an earthquake at Qumran that had destroyed the building, and that accounted for why the building was relatively uninhabited in the Herodian period. Now, this is sort of like saying Salome danced on the tabletop, and this accounted for why Herod the Tetrarch decided to execute John. He didn't want to, but his mind was turned. This is their explanation for the relative abandonment of Qumran in the time Herod was king under Roman sponsorship, from the time he stormed the temple in 37 BC to the time he died in 4 BC. Well, look here. How do we know there was a relative diminution in the habitation of Qumran? This is done through coin data. That is, the number of coins that are found, the dates on the coins, what are dropped here, what were found in the excavations. DeVoe did all the work here, and no one really has ever seen all of DeVoe's coins, and many are lost. But the point was, there certainly was a trend. If people are interested in my book, Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran, in the collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the First Christians, I give all of the numbers for the coins at different periods. But there certainly is a high point, a relative high point in the middle of the Maccabean period, which is around the time that this may have been functioning and founded. The coins then trail off to about 40 BC in the Herodian period. Then there's only about 1 or 2 until about 4 BC or 7 AD when they start picking up again, and they reach a high point at the time of the war against Rome from 66 to 68. Now, 68 is going to be an important number because it's a big argument about when this settlement or installation or fortification was abandoned. But the earthquake hypothesis, as it was called, comes from a notice in Josephus that in 31 BC there was an earthquake in the region. And that was taken as gospel for the reason that the peoples may have abandoned this area because it was destroyed. Now, Father DeVoe's assistant, Father Millick, found lots of burning and other sorts of things, burning dish shelves, burned pottery, a layer of destruction around this time too that was in very intense devastation that had occurred at that time. We came along, led by me in the middle 80s, and questioned the earthquake hypothesis. We said, look, if the people came back, and their hypothesis was that they came back in 4 BC or 7 AD, and it was a different movement then. By that time, it was more zealot movement, which is why you get the zealot strains in the literature at that time. That's the zealot hypothesis of Roth and Driver. Others just said they came back after they rebuilt after 4 BC to 7 AD. We said, if they could have come back in 4 to 7 AD, why didn't they come back in 30 AD? Why didn't they come back in 29 AD? Why didn't they come back in 28 AD, in 27 AD? Surely they weren't so frightened. We live in California, I do. An earthquake doesn't frighten us all into the far hill ranges. People come back and they rebuild. But in addition, on the whole, these installations are not living installations. They are, in fact, communal installations. Mostly the people lived either in tents or lean-tos here on the plateau or up in the caves. There's a lot of indication of life in the caves, combs, pottery, different things like that shows they used the caves for both habitation and storage, and they also lived here outside these communal buildings, which included perhaps a dining hall because dishes were found and things of that kind. So the question was let out. Why didn't they come back earlier? And the answer that we gave, there were political reasons. Now, to understand the political reasons, you had to see this group as not anti-Maccabean, which was the consensus theory, the Essene theory, the theory that you hear from almost all scholars. except for a few mavericks, but that they were anti-Herodian. Well, if you look in their documents, the things they say that would have upset Herod, if you see Herod as a kind of a Saddam Hussein, then you'll see that they said enough anti-Herodian things vis-a-vis Herodian marital practices, not sleeping with women in their periods, not multiplying wives, not being involved in polygamy, all things we know that Herod did, not marrying foreign wives, all things we know that Herod did, not marrying nieces, all things we know that Herod did, etc., and have no indication that the Maccabees, who were relatively pure-minded and the epitome in the first place of the Zealot movement, when the Maccabee books speak of Judas Maccabee's father, they speak of the zeal of Phineas as entitling him and his progeny to occupy the priesthood in perpetuity, and it's based on the fact of Phineas killing backsliders in the camp in the wilderness when they were marrying non-Jews. So the Maccabees were the most zealous and extreme priesthood you can imagine. Here are another group of extreme zealots. In what way could they be against the Maccabeans? But against the Herodians, that's something else. Now, the New Testament is portraying the Herodian priesthood, who are a relatively unacknowledged, illegitimate, collaborating priesthood. And so our theory has always been that the scrolls are misdated, that they're basically out by 100 years or so, and including the internal evidence, the dating going only on the external evidence of paleography and some of the archaeology of Father DeVoe, of which we're seeing here. So we said there were political factors. What were the political factors? Herod had a summer palace not 5 kilometers down the road here. He would not have tolerated a group like this disapproving his sexual and marital matters being anywhere near his summer palace. These people would have been cleared out the same way Saddam Hussein cleared out people. So, to check this, we did a radar ground scan back in 1992. That was one of our objects, to see if there's any indication of an earthquake fault line running through here. We did the whole scan from up there. I can't give you the precise details. It's in some of the articles that we have written. It's since been verified by other people who have come and done radar ground scans. From up there all the way down here in all of these loci. And what we found was that this crack here was part of a local displacement of the land that had a kind of semicircular pattern, the land giving way somewhat, but there was no indication of an earthquake fault line whatsoever at Qumran. An earthquake had ever occurred at Qumran. So in our view, the earthquake hypothesis was another one you hear talked about all of the time, but which is a priori wrong, and in fact influenced a lot of the dating and the considerations of what Qumran was and when it began and when it was flourishing. It is based on misconceptions about the orientation of what the Dead Sea Scroll Covenanters was all about, and it is finally the weakest point in the Essene theory. I think there was one point I missed. If I could, just let me think about it now. You can cut it and splice or do what you want. You don't want to keep it, throw it away. Another, I don't mean to overdo the weaknesses of this theory, but another thing that no one ever thought about in terms of the so-called earthquake hypothesis, just because they saw a notice in Josephus that there was an earthquake in 31 BC, and then said, oh, well, this is what caused this particular crack here along this stairway with no indication anywhere else. If in fact it was an earthquake that caused this, which we through the ground scan have subsequently proved that it wasn't, but even if it wasn't, even if it was, well, that earthquake could have occurred in 100 AD, 500 AD, 1000 AD, 1500 AD. We don't know when such an earthquake might have caused this kind of damage. That's the kind of childish, superficial, I call it dumbbell archaeology, the kind of really unsophisticated historical thinking and archaeological theorizing that we've had surrounding the whole subject of the Dead Sea Scrolls, mostly put in place by people who had an agenda or a previous connection, people who were under authority of some kind. On the Christian side, people who were under authority of various churches and religious movement. On the Jewish side, people who were totally focused on the subject of rabbinic Judaism, not understanding that this group was totally opposed to rabbinic Judaism too. And so all of the groups that were doing the theorizing and still doing the theorizing relating to Dead Sea Scrolls studies come from mindsets and authorities, most of them feeling they're under that authority. For instance, Millick says, the righteous teacher at Qumran would be just like our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, but there's no developed doctrine of the supernatural Christ. Well, that shows that he's preconceived, expecting there to be a picture of Jesus like in the Gospels. His mindset is under authority. So since the archaeology was done by those, since the theorizing was done by those people, they just don't do the detailed scientific consideration that we expect in most other subjects. The Dead Sea Scrolls is an extremely odd subject, peopled by people with extremely deep religious affiliations and mindsets, and the work they've done to some extent is vitiated because of that.
That was a very good point. Very good.
Didn't say it well, but maybe you'll get it out of me better some other time. It's hard to get your brain around it, you know. Okay. This relates to the actual coin data beyond when the earthquake was, the second stage of habitation, as most people put it, that led up to a crescendo in 68 AD at the time of the uprising against Rome. Everyone knows the uprising against Rome. We have Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, to document it, occurred between 66 and 70 AD. 68 to 70 really was what might call its Jacobin phase, when it went into its extreme phase, when all the revolutionaries killed all the high priests and burned their palaces and took over in a kind of semi-democratic zealot phase. I call it the Jacobin phase because I think that's the Jamesian phase anyway. I think these people in the Psalm 37 Pesher, it's shown that these people take vengeance for the death of the righteous teacher on the priest class. And so the Jews are not united in any way at all. But the consensus normative network of scroll scholars, we call it the consensus network, the Essene theory people, like to think that Qumran was abandoned in 68 before the temple fell. And they use coin data to prove that, saying that 68 is the last coin that they have found in this area that they can mark. Well, 68 was the beginning of the time Jerusalem would have been surrounded. So very few coins would have been getting out of Jerusalem anyway, with a mint date later than that. But finding a coin at a certain place is only a terminus a quo. It only tells you from what point the coin could have been dropped. In other words, the coin couldn't have been dropped any earlier than 68. It doesn't say that it was picked up in 68. It doesn't say it was actually dropped in 68. That's just the earliest date. Could have been 70. In other areas now, we found down here at Enfeshka, an agricultural area connected to this settlement, coins from 69. Up by this lookout that's about 4 kilometers down the road that's certainly connected to this location, we found coins from 69 and 70. So in fact, we don't even yet have all of DeVoe's coins. So just on the basis of coin data, we can't say that Qumran fell in 68. Why is it so important to the theorists? Because the Essene theorists say, aha, we've got you. One of the documents in the scrolls, the Habakkuk commentary, refers to the fall of the temple. Therefore, it couldn't have been the fall of the temple in 70 AD. It must have been the fall of the temple in an earlier time. 37 BC when Herod stormed the temple, 63 BC when Pompey stormed the temple, or even in the Judas Maccabee period. But this, again, is getting very complex. But the point is, it's a non sequitur once again. Because even if it was 68, people like Josephus knew that the temple was doomed. But then once again, even if they abandoned the buildings here in 68, it doesn't mean that they abandoned the site. They were living in caves and lean-tos. Earthquakes, burned buildings would have had no effect on their being in this site and their presence here. In fact, the only real terminus a quo, terminus to which, that you can actually speak of in these terminus ad quem, I mean, that you can actually speak about is the Bar Kokhba uprising, We have Bar Kokhba coins from 132 to 136 on this site. The only date that you can really be sure that the scrolls were deposited in the caves. Abandonment of the buildings here does not mean abandonment of the total area. Destruction of the buildings here, even if it was 68, does not mean abandonment of the total area. The only time the total area was finally abandoned was 136 AD. These scrolls could have been put into the caves in 68, in 69, in 70, any time up to when Masada fell in 73. In fact, any time up till 136. Finally, the reference to the fall of the temple is a very important one. It's in the Habakkuk commentary. We'll talk about it. And in the Habakkuk commentary, it says that the Romans, and with the Romans, took the booty from the temple. Well, here we have a very important notification, because in Josephus, going back to the time of Pompey in 63, Josephus specifically notes that Pompey did not want to offend the people and took no booty. In 37 BC, when Herod, backed by another Roman army, stormed the temple with the help of the Pharisees, Josephus specifically noted that Herod did not permit his soldiers to take any booty because he didn't want to antagonize the population. Rather, he paid the soldiers out of his own pockets. The only time booty was taken from the temple was in 70 AD. 70 AD under Vespasian and Titus. That we know for sure. They also probably got the secrets of the copper scroll. And you know what they did with that booty? They took it to Rome for victory celebrations, fun and games in stadiums, celebrations of birthdays, killing prisoners in all kinds of horrible ways with animals and so on. And finally, with the money from the temple, they built the Colosseum. Nothing, it was Vespasian and Titus who built the Colosseum. Nothing could be more ironic than that. From the beautiful Jewish holy site was produced this ogre monster of death that we still all celebrate and go and visit and worship, called the Colosseum. We film movies about the gladiator there, but it was built on blood money, real blood money, not Judas Iscariot's blood money, but blood money from the temple. Nothing is more disconcerting than that. Okay, well, here you see we're entering the graveyard, which is strung out before you here. There's about 1,000 graves here, all laid out in fairly good rows. Thousands is an interesting term for the Bible, but if you look closely at these graves, here's one to my left here. This is oriented, that's north, that's south. Normally speaking, we would not expect a Jewish grave or even a Muslim grave to be oriented in this direction. I have an explanation why these graves are oriented like this, and I'll tell you that in a moment, but you see they're all north and south. Occasionally, you come to an east-west grave, and it's been theorized that those are Bedouin graves that have been put into this graveyard later on. But we mapped this graveyard, University of Hartford, the University of Bar-Ilan, Magen Broshi's group, Hanan Eshel's group, and students from California State University Long Beach under my direction. Philip Reeder from the University of South Florida was directing that group. They mapped this graveyard over the last 3 years, so we now have a digital map of this graveyard and all the graves in it laid out for people. I think it's online. So now we want to walk down to what we consider to be the most phenomenal thing found in recent times in this graveyard, and then we'll talk about the north-south orientations of the majority of the graves. These graves too have been pillaged by grave robbers and antiquities hunters, and so anything you say about a grave, or if you say grave is important, a couple of weeks later the materials are gone. There's another problem in dealing with these graves. The rabbinic authorities are very sensitive about Jewish burials. They don't like people disturbing them for obvious reasons, and they consider these mostly to be Jewish burials. And therefore they get very, very excited if they feel people are incurring in the graves in some way, digging in in the graves or doing anything in the graves that is improper. And frankly, I sympathize with them completely. Here's a good north-south. Here's a good north-south grave here. Here's another one there. These are in rows. Here's another one here. They're just piles of rocks, as you can see, and not too far down is the body. In the early days of Qumran studies, there were some, in the DeVoe period, there were some different people who were criticized for digging up some of these graves. Some of these graves are now in Berlin, some of these bodies in Amman, I think, and some other places. They dug up around 15 or 20, I don't know what the actual numbers are. There have been studies done on the DNA and things, but I'm not au courant about that. The body is laid in the grave. The head faces towards the rising sun. The head is at this end, and I think the reason for that is so when they stand up, they look to the north. Normally, when a Jewish grave of the more modern rabbinic kind stands up, it stands up like that, looking towards the temple. And I think when you have a Muslim grave, it stands up like that, looking towards Mecca. Now, there's going to be a curious thing. Why are these people, if they're Jews, standing up looking towards the north? I think it relates to the bathing groups that I told you about. I think you'll find that all the bathing groups, this swath of area, from the 1st century BC even, or AD, on into the 3rd and 4th century AD, across the Fertile Crescent of northern Syria, you'll find in other areas around the Dead Sea that these El-Khazite, what the Muslims call Sabans, taken from the word Subba, daily immerser. The Muslims in the Quran consider the Sabans, in Aramaic the Mazbutans, Saba'a being the root relating to bathing. They think of them as people from Sheba in the south because they didn't know their history and they mistook all of these things. And they protected 3 groups, Jews, Christians, and Sabans. But you see, Muhammad wasn't protecting Sabans in an ancient pagan religion from Yemen and southern Arabia. What he was encountering here in Syria and what the Muslim armies encountered here in Palestine and Syria were bathers, Subba, Mazbutans, and even the Muslims misunderstand this. They think of them as stargazers. These people were the Sabans, or the Al-Khazites, and they were ritual bathers of the middle way between Jews and Christians. That's why they are protected peoples. That's why for the Muslims there are 3 protected peoples, Jews, Christians, and Sabans. The 3rd group are the daily bathers who claim to be following John the Baptist. We'll talk more about that again.
Okay, here we go. Go for it.
See, I wanted to do this when they weren't here. Okay, well, as you see, this is the graveyard, and we have our north-south graves running along where you see them. And then right over here on my left is a huge promontory of a very spectacular kind, which actually overlooks the whole north-south situation of the graveyard. And one wouldn't have expected it at the beginning, but you have a beautiful view of the road south, a beautiful view of the road north, but it's the high point of the